Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you tonight to the Hudson Library Historical Society's virtual author series. Tonight's streaming event will feature author Becky Cooper. Just a quick note that our virtual author series will continue on Thursday, November 19th at 7 p.m. with New York Times bestselling author Michael Punk, the author of The Revenant, the novel of revenge. The book is based on the astonishing real-life tale of trapper and frontiersman Hugh Glass and is a gripping, hard-edged tale of survival, revenge, and ultimately redemption. It was the basis for the Academy Award-winning film with Leonardo DiCaprio, which finally got him his Oscar. And registration you can find on our website at hudsonlibrary.org. Okay. At any point tonight, you can feel free to ask questions. There should be the Q&A down below. Please leave your questions there for our author, and we will dedicate a section of tonight's program to answer any questions you may have. So, and if you're on Facebook, please leave in the comments and we'll try to get to your questions as well. Becky has also signed book plates for books purchased through the Learned Owl. We're going to include the link to purchase the books in the chat. So if you want to go ahead, if you're interested in purchasing a book, click the link and support our local independent bookshop. So without further ado, let's get on to tonight's question. Let's introduce tonight's speaker. Becky Cooper is a former New Yorker editorial staff member. She's the author of 2 books, Mapping Manhattan, a love and sometimes hate story in maps by 75 New Yorkers. And most recently, We Keep the Dead Close, A Murder at Harvard and Half a Century of Silence, which was just released last week. Her graduate thesis was a literary biography of David Foster Wallace and won Harvard's Hope's Prize, the highest undergraduate award for research and writing. Research for this book, We Keep the Dead Close, was supported by the Fund for Investigative Journalism and the International Women's Media Foundation's Howard G. Buffett Award for Women Journalists. Please join me in welcoming Becky Cooper. Hi, Becky. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Hi, Jenna. Thanks for that introduction, and thank you for hosting me at the Hudson Library. I really appreciate it.
So I have to tell everyone who's tuning in, I know this book just came out last week, and I have to say I was lucky enough to read an advanced copy of it, and I just thoroughly enjoyed the book. I could not stop reading it, and I've already recommended it to friends. So people tuning in tonight, I highly recommend you picking up a copy as soon as possible. So let's get started. So you spent 10 years researching the case and writing this book. I was hoping you could talk about what sparked your initial interest in this story, about this case, about the first time you heard of Jane.
Absolutely. So the book is about the murder of a woman named Jane Britton, who was a Harvard archaeology student at Harvard in 1969. But her story kind of found me. I was an undergraduate, and it was the spring of my junior year in 2009. And I was having lunch with a friend of mine when her boyfriend decided to join us. And, I had kind of wanted alone time with my friend. And so I thought, well, if he's going to join us, then the least he could do is share a classic Morgan tale in exchange, because I didn't know very much about him, but I knew that he was kind of legendary around the school for his stories. And so I bait him with some, Harvard lore, of which there are tons of stories. And he says, well, if you want to hear a really crazy Harvard story. And he proceeds to tell me what's it feels like a well-worn academic horror story almost. And he says, there was a woman, he didn't know her name, who had an affair with her professor on the dig they were on together in Iran in the summer of 1968. And when they got back, she wouldn't give up the affair. And the professor couldn't have people finding out about it. And so one day he went over to her apartment and they talked. And he bludgeoned her with a stone tool that he took from the Peabody Museum, which is Harvard's anthropology museum. And then according to this rumor, this professor took the body back to his office and he laid her down on his desk and he put 3 necklaces on her that they had found together on their dig in Iran. And on top of that, he had sprinkled this red powder known as red ochre, which is iron oxide, over her body in what some believe to be a perfect recreation of, the Neolithic burial ritual that they had found. And the next day, police questioned the professor, and the school newspaper wrote an article about it. And according to this rumor, the school found out about this article and couldn't have one of their own be connected to such a salacious and awful tragedy. And so they forced the Crimson, the newspaper, to change the story. And by that afternoon, the story was gone. And, the press stopped writing, the police stopped talking. And for the next 45 years, the case remained unsolved. And I knew enough not to believe that story fully. It seems obviously embroidered, but there was something about it that barbed me. And I think what it is that it had crafted a villain out of Harvard that I recognized. So it wasn't that I did believe it, but that I kind of could believe it. Because I had a really wonderful time at Harvard as an undergrad. There was a sense that kind of anything was possible, and you just had to, put out 3 wishes, and those 3 wishes could come true. But at the same time, it's not too hard imagining that omnipotence having a flip side. And, the same thing that could make Harvard kind of skirt the rules around, you didn't have to be 21 to drink, or they could write you a letter for getting a visa, was also the kind of same power that I could imagine silencing an unflattering story. And so it lived kind of in me as this kind of fable that I found interesting, but I didn't fact check, and I didn't tell anyone else about it until about a year later, when I was early for an advising meeting. And my advisor, I was literature, but my advisor happened to be an archaeologist, and he was having a meeting with somebody already. And, they kind of motioned me over to join them. And they were talking about the Harvard professor that people at the university kind of like to speculate was the inspiration for Indiana Jones. And they're telling me, it wasn't rare for archaeologists to be spies, that was a very common cover. And I just couldn't help myself. They're talking about double identities and espionage and archaeologists. And I say, well, if you want to hear a really crazy Harvard story. And I launch into this like half-remembered story at this point. And I'm feeling mortified because these are people in the anthropology department. And I'm repeating the story back to them, and I haven't fact-checked any of it. And I get through it as quickly as I can. And at the end of it, they look at me and they don't say anything. And then finally, my advisor says, well, what you're describing didn't happen in the Peabody Museum. It happened in her apartment. And the other student says, and that professor that you're talking about, he's still on faculty. And it was at that point that the story kind of radically shifted for me from this fable to this horrible open secret, possibly, that I couldn't understand if any of it was as true as they sort of seemed to think it was, why we weren't taking it seriously. And I was kind of unwilling to let it be something I just whispered about someone. So I thought, maybe I could be the person who could take it seriously.
It seems like so much of the book was about separating the myth from the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I love the one quote in there: some realities need to be fictionalized in order to be apprehended.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like the whole story, you're chasing down a story you heard or a myth you heard, and then uncovering the truth. And like, what was the lore? Like, you said the female students had passed down this story to the generations, so like it had taken on it was like a well-known secret, it felt like.
Yeah, so people outside the anthropology department at Harvard really didn't know the story. If it weren't for the fact that my advisor was an archaeologist, I don't think I would have ever heard the story corroborated again. But people within the anthropology department all kind of knew about it. It turned out, as I started investigating it. And it turned out, graduate students were warned about the department and about the specific professor before they became students at Harvard. And, I think the process of investigating the story for me was taking the lurid details of my friend Morgan's story, which some of it was not true. There were no necklace details. I think that actually is a very interesting torquing of the Heinrich Schliemann story of Troy, which is a whole other story to get into. But the red ochre detail, or at least the red powder detail, turns out to be true. that there was in fact red powder sprinkled at the crime scene or tossed or thrown about. Was this the kind of perfect clue, or was it an act of hubris, or was it a red herring of whose significance is kind of our own invention? But at the same time, I think as I got deeper and deeper and deeper into the story, it wasn't so much that my task was simply to separate out what had kind of evolved into myth over time in, as you say, like the graduate students passing a dossier between one generation to the next. But in fact, what the myth that they were telling had evolved to speak to. So, the quote that you had just said, which is by an anthropologist named Vina Das, where it's talking about realities needing to be fictionalized in order to be apprehended. As I got deeper and deeper and deeper into the story, and I started to be less and less convinced that the professor at the heart of this rumor had in fact killed this woman named Jane Britton, as I later found out. I started to ask myself two questions. One is, all right, if he didn't do it, then who did? And then the second question is, if he didn't do it, then why is this the story that history has decided to tell and retell? And so to go back to that quote, I sort of saw my job as reverse engineering. If that was the fiction, this professor killed this woman because of an affair. Well, then what was the reality that myth was gesturing at that gave it such staying power? And that, I think, for me, was really the gateway to understanding the kind of gender discrimination and silencing that women face in academia.
Yeah, I loved what you just said there, and I liked the importance of why the story had such staying power within the department and the meanings people were taking from that. I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on Jane Britton, who was our victim here. I liked how you painted her as a full person. Like, you heard both positive and negative. I mean, at the end, she just felt real, not so much depersonalized. I wonder if you could tell a little bit about our victim and a little bit about her life and what got her to there.
Jane Britton was funny as hell. Her best friend described her to me as a mixture between Dorothy Parker and Groucho Marx, just without the mustache. She's the sort of person that I, at least, would love to hang out with. She when she got depressed, she would just go in her convertible with her best friend down to Revere Beach with, like, it would be in the middle of winter, but they'd have the top down, the wind in their hair. People described her as almost kind of incandescent. She had a tendency to work kind of furiously in some moments, and then in other moments kind of slink in her room and only scurry out for occasional meals. She was known probably more than anything for her occasionally caustic wit, her morbid sense of humor. Sometimes she would kind of disappear from classes for a stretch of time. And a couple of graduate students who were in the room when this happened said that she came down to the Peabody smoking room, so the museum smoking room where all the graduate students and some of the tenured, but mostly non-tenured faculty hung out. And Jane kind of, I imagine her swinging the door open, but she probably just walked in. She said, rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated, quoting Mark Twain, which now resonates with a much greater degree of significance than it probably did at the time. But she was the daughter of a Radcliffe. Radcliffe was Harvard's sister school at the time. Radcliffe had vice president of administration and the daughter of a former professor. And so she grew up in a suburb of Boston, and it was a very repressed New England childhood. But I think Jane rebelled against the repression by being that kind of bombastic, funny, caustic version of herself. And she channeled the pressure that I think her parents put on her into her studies. So, she was voted most likely to succeed. She was the only one to get into from her high school class to get into Radcliffe. And this was before her father started working for the school. And she was extremely sexually independent and kind of unabashed about it. She told her friend that if a guy bore her, she would just sleep with him to get rid of him. And one of the complicated and very interesting things about writing about Jane was that I came to believe that she might not have been the most reliable narrator of herself. And not only that, but even her closest friends had the sense that perhaps only one or two sides of her were showing at any given moment. And so many of them asked me, I think you should talk to this person or this person, because in order to get a full picture of who Jane is, you have to talk to a wide variety of people. So I think it was that, and then the fact that underneath her kind of fierceness and her ambition was a kind of streak of vulnerability and shyness, and more than that, a kind of psychic loneliness is how I've come to term it. Her boyfriend at the end of her life was someone named Jim Humphreys, and their relationship really blossomed on the dig they were on together in Iran. And when asked about their relationship after her death, one of the fellow diggers said, in Iran, it really seemed like they had a chance to feel for each other's loneliness. And so I think it was at its core that kind of need to be seen and to be understood in more than just a kind of romantic sense, which really drew me to Jane, especially in juxtaposition with how driven and dynamic she also was simultaneously.
Thank you. So I liked how you said you talking to some of her friends. I was wondering if you could go into a little detail on the investigative process, because it sounds like, one, you talked to a lot of different people. Some people said yes, some people said no. I wondered if you could break that down of how you approached tackling this case.
Yeah, I was really, for most of investigating the story, extremely scared because the case was unsolved. I didn't know who the murderer was. The rumors about who the murderer might be implicated two people who were very much alive. And so one of the early pieces of advice I had gotten from somebody in the anthropology department was to just kind of tiptoe in from the outside. And so after auditing the professor at the heart of the original rumors class, because I just wanted to kind of gauge the scale of his personality, really. The next thing I did was just kind of tiptoe around the periphery by talking to people who were graduate students around my time and who else maybe I should talk to. And then it really seemed safest to me to get to know who Jane was, to understand, what her life was like at Radcliffe. And so I managed to find the Radcliffe, I think it was the yearbook, or maybe it was the Facebook of everyone in the freshman class. And it listed what dorm Jane was in. And then I just went through, research and detective work is really unsexy. And I just went through and looked at like hundreds of pages to find every girl who was also in Cabot House. And then I looked and tried to find every phone number of every one of those girls. And then I called every one of those girls. And finally, one of them said, I remember Jane. And, you really should speak to this tall, skinny girl with a mop of curly hair named Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, it turned out, was Jane's best friend. And that kind of opened all the doors for me, because Elizabeth had stayed in touch with Jane's brother. And it was through Elizabeth that Boyd, her brother, started sending me emails. And so that chain of trust was really crucial. And then, I kind of tiptoed closer to who were the graduate students around the time of Jane's being there. And simultaneously, I also realized that if I was going to do the kind of investigative work that Jane needed, because it over the years that I was working on the book, it pivoted quite obviously from this horrible open secret that we were all just carrying around into something that demanded a lot more journalistic skill. And so I started working at the New Yorker magazine to kind of hopefully learn by osmosis and by the generosity of the staff writers there, truly how to, file Freedom of Information Act requests or use Nexus. And after 2.5 years of doing that, which was just an incredible opportunity, I left to work on the book full time and go on this massive reporting trip and go on an archaeological dig to really understand the kind of immersive insanity of the book. And then finally once I had gathered as much information as I possibly could, to then speak to the people around whom constellations of suspicion kind of accumulate, to both explain to them the project that I was working on, and also to kind of come to them on their own terms.
Yeah, I mean, I loved all of the firsthand interviews you had in there, and especially talking to the family. I thought it was handled as delicately as you can, especially when you're bringing up a cold case that is potentially rather upsetting. I was wondering if what challenges did you face along the way? One of the things I got early is there was a lot of, when the murder originally happened, there was a lot of, I'm trying to find the right word, mishandlings, or like the stuff that would be a red flag now with the way the case was handled from the police and the lines of questioning. I was wondering if there was any other challenges that presented to you along the way of trying to uncover this.
Well, that was interesting. It doesn't spoil anything, but that was one of the original parts of the Jane Britton myth, that there was some kind of misconduct way back in the day. And that was one of the things that actually turned out to be true. And it was amazing to be able to, for a culture of such secrecy, especially in Massachusetts, it was amazing to be able to kind of, I don't know the why, but I know the what. Anyway, the other challenges along the way, I mean, I think you said that in your segue, the challenge of understanding how to approach the story with the kind of sensitivity that I would hope, God forbid, some tragedy would happen to someone I know, someone would approach the story with the sensitivity with me or with them. And it was really hard, the son of one of the people who was involved in Jane's inner circle emailed me and asked for me to seriously reconsider what I was doing because of the hurt that I was causing to people, or possibly causing to people, because this had happened, so early in their life. Jane was 23, just about to turn 24, and so were so many of the people around her. And a little less than 50 years had elapsed since then, and maybe they had achieved a kind of rocky peace. And was I really so sure that my pursuit was going to do anything but create harm? Because I couldn't promise them resolution, I couldn't promise them closure or a solution. And it seemed, at least to the person emailing me, that the only thing that it seemed true that I was causing was pain. And I felt that responsibility constantly and acutely. And I after I got that email, I contacted Don, who is in the book. He's one of my main characters in the book. He was one of Jane's close friends and neighbors, and he, despite our kind of rocky beginning when he didn't want to talk to me, he became one of the most stalwart champions of this quest. And I emailed him and I said, what do I do? The subject line we both remember was hurt and pain, because at that point too, the detectives had I think partially spurred by Mike Widmer, one of the early journalists, the earliest journalist on the scene in 1969, had been kind of filing these incessant public records requests with Middlesex. They found this DNA from the crime scene, and they were now going back and testing all of the people in Jane's inner circle to see if they either matched or could be excluded. And this detective was flying out to where Don lived. And suddenly Don was not a man in his 70s, but he was the scared 25-year-old he was when his best friend was murdered, and he was worried that somehow the cops would find a way to frame it on him. And so I was like, I'm even causing pain to you, and you'd believed in this story fully. And I said, how do I move on? How do I justify going forward? And he said, some people don't want to revisit the past. It causes them pain. But for him, revisiting the past was a chance to kind of free himself from the version he had been trapped inside for the last 50 years. That, the way he phrased it, it gave him new paths through the woods. And that was regardless of finding a solution, finding another way to frame the story or to consider it had the process of healing for him in and of itself. And I think maybe you saw this in the book, and you'll see it if you read it. A theme throughout the book is the festering power of silence, and how corrosive it is. And so the spotlight I was trying to shine on Jane and on what happened to her, I was hoping to be a kind of antidote to that pain. And then finally, I think the deeper I got into Jane's story, the more I realized that investigating it wasn't just about injustice that happened to one woman on one night. That the way, at least the way I read it, Jane's story was being wielded in the anthropology community was to discuss the kind of institutional silencing of women in academia that otherwise has no outlet, or at least no outlet without retaliation sometimes.
It felt like it was almost a cathartic experience for some of the people associated with the case to be able to talk not just about the crime, but about their friend and like the memories they had with her. It felt like some people, at least, I mean, obviously just from my perception of reading it, that people really enjoyed being able to talk about her as a person versus like what happened.
Yeah.
And that was, I really enjoyed. It felt more connected, at least I thought. I just want to remind people as we're going on, if you have any questions for tonight, please drop them in the Q&A section and we'll get to that shortly. So I have, all right, this is a good question. What was the significance of the book's title?
The book's title, We Keep the Dead Close, is a paraphrase of the professor around whom the original rumor circulates or is about. So when I audited his class, he was teaching a class on Near Eastern civilizations, and he's talking about the people of the Ain Malaha. And he says, what was one of the things that was notable about that community, about the civilization, is that the people buried their dead, their ancestors, under the floorboards of their kitchen. And he turns to everyone and he says, they kept the dead close. And I circled it in my notebook. And I recognized, even in that moment, it was going to have kind of hefty thematic resonance for the book, because what I really tried hard to do was have it not just be a book about a murder, but a book about the kind of afterlife of a murder, the way in which, the way in which we tell stories about the past, the way in which we hold the people who came before close, reveals something about who we are, or also reveals something about the way we want to be seen. This professor said in an earlier class that archaeology is often wielded to modern ends. The past that we find is often reappropriated to say something about our present. And he gave the example that in Saudi Arabia, for instance, the government had commissioned a number of archaeologists to dig there because, the nation states around them, they had invented agriculture and writing, and in Saudi Arabia, they wanted a similarly illustrious history. And these archaeologists come back more or less empty-handed, or at least the past that they're digging up is not the kind of level of the past that the commissioning government wanted to find. And they decommissioned the whole brigade. And to me, We Keep the Dead Close is trying to examine the ways in which that closeness is honoring or using, and what can we tell about ourselves based on how we allow the dead to speak for or through us.
Thank you. There was a book, and I can't remember the title now, but it talked all about the cultures of death, like all around the globe and how people handle it. And it kind of, that title in that section of the book reminded me of the book about how people just want to feel close, like physically close to their loved ones who have passed on, because it brings a measure of comfort and like security to them. And it reminded me of that. I'm trying to think here. So I'm going to ask real quick before we jump into some Q&A, a little bit about your writing process, because I know we have a lot of aspiring writers in our audience, and I know we have writing groups that are very interested in. So I was wondering if you could describe your writing process. How do you get started? What does your writing day look like?
Sure. I am happiest when I have organized my stuff to the point where, as I told a friend of mine, it feels more like stitching than it feels like creating. So part of the reason that this book took so long was just I was trying to amass all this information into chronologies and into various documents. But eventually it got to the point where I swear by Scrivener, the word processing software. If you don't have it and you're trying to write a book, get it. I'm not sponsored by them, but they changed my life. So I had two different Scrivener documents. I had one exclusively for my research that was organized by character, location, sometimes timeline, sometimes if I knew there was a specific part of the story, like part of the book takes place in Guatemala, there was a whole section for Guatemala. And then the second Scrivener document was kind of the file that I started writing in. And I would split my pane like this. And on one of the panes, I would have all the primary source documents organized as if it were in the chapter itself. So kind of temporally and chronologically. And then on this pane, I would have my writing. And so I would just kind of scroll down and write this way. And so, I would look at the photo and then describe the photo here. And, so it wasn't really, I wasn't doing any conjuring. I was like just painting the numbers as I saw it. And the other thing that really helped if you're anything like me and you're writing a kind of work of historical nonfiction, I used my iCalendar, which I never use, as a timeline for Jane's story, and I color coded it by character. And because the book is so fragmented and things aren't linear, and I didn't want to lose track of a really important scene, I also had a different color if I had already used it. And so I could very easily see, I didn't use Jane's story from college year 2. And so I could put that in section 2, say. And what's my ideal writing day? I work best in the morning. I eat a big bowl of oatmeal and then coffee, and then just go to town, and probably by like 5 o'clock I'm useless, and so I'll do some kind of moving around thing and then try to go to sleep eventually.
Sounds good. Are you working on your next book?
No, not yet. I think after so long, I really haven't lived my adult life without this book. And, I think for any writer, I imagine the time after a book is a period of grieving in some way, and of getting to know a stranger. And so this has been a particularly strained and fraught and difficult time to do any kind of rebirth. And so I think just trying to figure out who I am separate from this book has been my project.
I would say after 10 years, I think instead of researching this, that's a significant chunk of your life to spend on the same topic.
Yeah.
People. All right. So we're going to turn it over to some questions from the audience, if that's okay. So I know you said you don't have a plan right now for a future book, but would you be open to doing more investigative type books, or is there a different genre that you would potentially like to explore?
I'm definitely open to doing more investigative works. I think what is drawing me the most right now is science writing. I started college as a neuroscience concentrator, and I've never really left that behind. What that would look like exactly, I have a couple of things that similar to Jane's story for the early part of those years, I kind of think about as living in the attic of my brain. I'm stealing that from another writer, and I don't remember who, so I can't give credit. But anyway, I'm just sort of like, I visit it every so often. I'm like, how you doing? And it's still there. So, I'll organize it and think about it someday. But probably something in that vein.
All right. Oh, yeah, a lot of questions all over the board. Let's see here. Another question real quick on writing. Do you write as you research, or do you do all the researching before you start writing?
My favorite thing to do for all of writing is figure out structure. And I really don't know how to figure out structure unless I have like 90% of my material. So I had most of the book before I started writing. I mean, what's interesting about the structure of this book is that the case is solved in 2018, but I had written sections 1 and 2 of the book. But those talk about Jane in, the investigation in 1969 and Jane in section 2. And so that actually didn't fundamentally alter the structure. And if anything, it kind of, in a strange way, accentuated the themes that I was kind of driving toward anyway. So this book in some ways is the exception to my, like, I need 90% of it before I start writing. But in general, I'm happiest having all the material and then kind of letting the material announce its own structure. I love John McPhee talking about how he figures out. It's kind of like, was it Michelangelo talking about letting the statue announce its own form? It feels the same to me.
I know this is jumping off of that. I know when you started writing, it was a cold case. There was no conclusion, and we're not going to spoil what happened. But how did you go about writing a book where at the beginning there was no outcome? Did you hope to find an outcome, or were you just hoping to shed some light on this story?
At the very beginning, it felt like an open secret, and I wasn't even thinking about it as a book. I was just confused why we were happy to relegate it to hallways and whispers. And then as I got deeper and deeper into it, I felt a kind of responsibility to Jane and to the people in her life, and then to this larger story about gender discrimination in academia. But in terms of how exactly the book was going to work without a solution, I really didn't know, and I was pushing it as far as I could. I had imagined that last section of the book would be a kind of philosophical musing on what a story is and why we need them, and what desire of guilt means about us. But whether that would have been legally exoneratingly sufficient, I had no idea. And so I was just I'm going to push this, and I think my parents really were crucial in the freedom of that approach, because they said, you will be done with this book whether or not you actually are able to finish it. In order for you to be free of it, you need to see how far it'll go. And so my mother especially really understood before I did how much this story had kind of stuck to me, and the only way for me to be on the other side of it was just to see. And if the answer was it's not possible, then at least I'd have tried.
It seems like this was a story that got personal real quickly, and one that the devotion to researching it. I know I read in an article that Michelle McNamara's I'll Be Gone in the Dark became an obsession, and she just needed to find the killer. That did you feel the same way?
Yeah, I read McNamara's book too, and I mean, maybe my friends have a better gauge of this than I do, but I don't think I was quite so consumed in every aspect of my life. I mean, I managed to keep my investigation pretty secret from even some of the people that I'm closest to. When I was working at the New Yorker and I would research this on mornings and weekends, one of my closest friends, Ben Taub, would sit across from me at the desk, and I wouldn't tell him what I was working on. And, when I'd go to the bathroom, I'd take my computer with me. And for years this happened. And we had a whole friendship sort of separate from this. And so, I mean, maybe this is my own conception of what it would mean to be so obsessed and consumed with something. But, I just think sometimes when it's that level of obsession, or at least the way that it's discussed, it seems like, there was no life for me separate from this book. And I think if that were true, the kind of experience of the darkness of living inside of it would have been just insufferable, and I wouldn't have been able to kind of have the stamina to stay in it. But for me, it was something that I felt a responsibility toward, and that drive to tell Jane's story fully and to be as honest and responsible and meticulous to the other stories of the people in her life, I think it was much more driving me toward something than it was a kind of grinding down inside myself.
Thank you. So we have a lot more questions. We'll get back to them. How much of the story is due to the mishandling of the case by the Cambridge police in the first instance?
It's interesting. I don't, how am I going to answer this? I don't think that much. I don't think the original mishandling is why the case remained unsolved for nearly 50 years. It is hard to say this definitively without any idea of the why the mishandling happened, because I have the what in documents, but in terms of the why, everyone I spoke to just refused to comment. So, my sense is that it has nothing to do with what happened to her the night she was killed. And it has little to nothing, absolutely nothing to do with who killed her. But can I say that 100%? No, I have no proof that it has absolutely nothing to do with it, but that's kind of how it smells to me. But I think it's still important in terms of understanding another instance of police misconduct.
Sue brings up a very good question about the gender discrimination in academia. Do you think academia is less sexist than it was back then?
That's a really good question. It is less overtly sexist. I mean, women in archaeology specifically weren't allowed to go on many of the digs. They didn't have access to the same fellowship and scholarship money. But, Harvard's archaeology department still, other than one woman briefly, has never had a tenure female faculty member. In 2018, a National Academy of Sciences study found that 58% of all women in academia, I think this was specifically looking at faculty, had experienced sexual harassment. A Harvard study done, I think this year, found that 40% of female faculty knew somebody in their department who had experienced sexual harassment or misconduct, which is up from 22-point-something% 2 years before. And even if you're looking at, yes, anthropology, for instance, it has more female graduate students than male graduate students. But if you look at the numbers at Harvard of the withdrawals within the archaeology department or program within the anthropology department, in the last 30 years, of all of the withdrawals, 87% have been women. And so, I think academia hasn't really done a good job of dismantling the old power structures that enable these kinds of forms of social reproductions to happen along class, race, gender lines. That, you see this also in tenure. Tenure at Harvard especially is this black box where you don't get any feedback. You don't understand who's saying yes or no to you. And then you get someone like Professor Lorgia Garcia Pena, who was a beloved teacher, getting denied tenure. And at the same time that Harvard is saying, we want to hire 3 to 4 new ethnic studies professors, they're also denying tenure to, the person who had enabled a secondary studies track for ethnic studies within history and literature. And so, without the kind of transparency of that process and the kind of distrust that's built up against the institution over time, there's really no accountability and no recourse. And so I think, there are ways in which it's getting better, or at least some of the right steps are being taken, like the government department after the Jorge Dominguez scandal, where, over 4 decades, more than 18 women have accused him of sexual assault, sexual misconduct, and harassment. You know, the government department is now doing an external review, but this was after more than a year of asking for it. They have owned up to the fact that there is a systemic failure, but Harvard hasn't apologized to the women or admitted that they've done anything wrong. And are they examining the ways in which Title IX and ODR investigations are going on to hear the women specifically, or men who have gone through the process, to understand the ways in which, being a student going up against a powerful faculty member, or an adjunct professor going up against a powerful faculty member, to understand the ways in which, like, those vulnerabilities are only compounded in that situation when you don't have access to the same resources. So yes, the government department is trying, or the anthropology department, after the most recent scandal, has said, we are forming a committee, and they no longer accept graduate students whose interests only align with one senior faculty member. Now it's, you have to align with 3 to limit dependence. But is that enough? Like, is saying that, we want to diffuse a power hierarchy, which is important and good and necessary in order to limit the vulnerabilities that people face in departments who aren't the kind of powerful tenured members? Is that sufficient if you're not then going to examine, the idea of tenure itself?
This is actually a very good segue, because you're dealing with such a powerful institution, and because there was the ability to silence a lot of this that's going on, did you ever feel unsafe at any point, or concerned with your topic, if it would anger or upset the wrong people within Harvard and outside of the case?
Yeah, I mean, I had the sense that I was kind of existing within a spider web. Anthropology especially is a very, very small world. And it turned out that the person who first told me the story was actually the son of the disciple of the professor at the heart of the story that he told me. So it's not even like this person felt safe anymore. And I think I had underestimated how vulnerable I would feel going back to Harvard's campus to write this story when the case was still unsolved. Walking the streets and being right near those departments, in the jurisdiction of the Cambridge and Harvard police. And I had even taken a self-defense course with the Harvard police, where they gave me what they called a Q baton. It was this like ribbed metal shiv, and they taught me how to jam it down in the kind of triangle of flesh between your clavicle and your shoulder blade, to ward off any would-be attackers. And I had that in my pocket all the time walking through Cambridge. And it was so awkward because I hadn't told many of the undergraduates who I would, eat meals with in the dining hall what it was that I was working on. And then suddenly this like huge metal thing would like clunk down right next to my breakfast oatmeal, and they'd look at me like, what is that? And I would, kind of have to laugh it off. But I really did feel kind of acutely vulnerable also when I was going to, doorstep people in the book who weren't expecting me necessarily. And I was acutely aware of, my frame and my vulnerability.
I did love the sections when you just doorstepped people and you just walked up, and I was like, I don't know if I could have the courage to do that.
It's also so not characteristic of me. I don't think I'm a particularly pushy person. And so to like go bother someone in their life in that way, physically, it was a different me. Or it was in pursuit of Jane that I did that.
I mean, I enjoyed it. I was like, oh, I don't know. Richard asks, how do you think, he says, LK, which I think he means Carl, lived for so many years under suspicion and under the cloud of Jane's murder? Do you think he realized what the graduate students have heard? Have they been passed? Was he aware of how the rumor had been passed down?
I asked him when we sat down for lunch for our first in-person interview. One of the first things that I said to him, because he turns to me and he's like, "Have you found the killer yet?" And I, he's kind of playing with me with that question because, he would know, I would know. And I say yes. And he's like, "Huh?" And I said, "No, I'm kidding." And we talk about the kind of suspects that history likes to talk about, but he had named, instead of the usual three, which include him, he had named another person. And so it felt inappropriate for me to say anything, but that people talk about you having been involved. And that was the first time I was addressing it directly with him. And he said, "Oh, sure." And it was, I write in the book that, he was saying, "Oh, sure," as if I had just asked him if he enjoyed vacations. A number of the graduate students, of which you are one, Richard, they told me that it seemed that Carl, this professor, knew what people said about him and almost wore it as this kind of cape of darkness, that in Harvard's anthropology department, it was equally powerful to be feared as it was to be respected. And that this story added a kind of dark prestige. And I heard that from multiple people. When I asked Carl about it, he said, "I didn't derive any particular machismo aspect from Jane's story at all." But, it's almost as if enough people believed this to be true and enough people sort of saw him as Count Dracula, it did in fact change the way that people interacted with him. So do I think that he was as deeply aware of it? I'm not sure. Even as recently as a few years ago, I was talking to Sadie Weber in the book, and she said that she and a number of other graduate students were talking together in a room in the Peabody Museum, and Carl walks in. And then he walks out, they exchange some words, then he walks out, and then they look down in horror at what's on the table, because it's like a photocopy of an article about Jane Britton's murder, just like right in the open. And it seemed obvious that Carl had seen it. One of the graduate students jokes that the person whose newspaper it was, they were like, "You're next." But it seems impossible when, out of nowhere, 45 years later, somebody would just randomly have that article. It seems hard to believe that he wouldn't be aware of the fact of its, how alive it was on campus. But I'm not sure how much people dared to actually talk to him about it. I think it was something, where it just kind of, it surrounded him and he was the negative space.
He says, "I agree, and it completely provided dark prestige to his mystique."
Thanks, Richard.
We have another question from Gwen. She would like to know about your archival research.
I love librarians. Thank you. Yes, archival research was a huge part of working on this book. I joke in the book, but it's true that writing a story about Harvard is a particular pleasure because Harvard saves everything about itself. And yeah, at the beginning I go in because I wanted to find Don Mitchell, the friend and neighbor who I spoke about, had this kind of mystery professor whose name he doesn't give, but I know, his position on faculty. I know the year that he died. And it seems almost this kind of perfect set of clues that would be enough for me to just go through a directory to like list everyone's name, cross-check when they died, and then figure out this person's name. Or similarly, Jane had a mystery boyfriend who nobody knew, named Jerry Roth. And I was like, I can find this in a library. And then later on, when I wanted to reconstruct what it was like for Jane and the rest of the people on the Tepe Yahya dig in 1968, I realized that the field notebooks that they had each kept that summer were in the Peabody Museum. And so I got to go there and I got to look at these notebooks, and it was just the most incredible feeling because the notebooks were still covered with the kind of fine dust from the Iranian desert all these years later. and I got to see in Jane's handwriting her writing about red ochre. And then finally, when Carl finally retired, his papers were all donated to Harvard. And so I got to go to the Harvard archives and trawl through almost every paper he had saved over his, 47-year career at Harvard. And it was, a particularly delicious scavenger archaeological hunt expedition, because he had so recently retired that the archive hadn't even been processed. And so, I only had this little like finding aid that was like, this box pertains to the top shelf. This box pertains to, it was just like directions in his office. And I think, talking to any researcher who delights in going to libraries, like that's the dream. Like you get to be the first person looking through all of this stuff, and some librarian just like wheels this treasure to you. I mean, it was incredible.
I have another question here from Anna. She said, in something like this, I imagine you must have encountered so many loose ends that time has obscured to the point you can never tie them off. How do you decide when to let something go and move on?
It was hard. I mean, it was hard, especially when it was an unsolved case, because, I lived with the guilt that like maybe it was that clue or that person that was the reason why the case had remained unsolved. Like, what if you just talk to one more person? Because each person, was like, talk to these 15 people. And I would talk to 13. And in one instance in the book that I write about, it was the 15th person that turned out to give me the exact clue that I needed for this aspect of the story. After the case was solved, it was a lot easier to understand, like, oh, I don't really need to go into this rabbit hole. I was grateful that happened closer to the editing process of the book. Because you're right. I mean, it was just this constant feeling of guilt of I could be doing more. And until this case is solved, I should be doing more.
We have a few more questions before we go in tonight. Let's see here. Did you always plan on being a writer, or would hearing this story in particular launch you onto this career path?
I thought I was going to be, well, in high school, I thought I was going to be a forensic scientist. I really did love secrets and trying to solve mysteries. But by the time I got to college, I thought I was going to be a neuroscientist. I was pre-med track all the way, didn't do any writing classes. The one mandatory writing class I took was on science or imagining science. So I really didn't read. But it was, it was a couple of things. I think I had some incredible high school English teachers, Mr. Grossman and Miss Ojallo, if you're watching. I had a great friend, Kat, who would take me to bookstores and be like, read this, read this, read this. So I think under my desire to be a neuroscientist was also my desire to write, that I think someone like Oliver Sacks, who kind of managed to juggle both worlds, was what I aspired to, though not exactly the kind of writing he did. But you're right. I mean, I think I kept saying, I'll go to med school as soon as these stories are done. And I wanted to do my math book first, and then I wanted to do this book about Jane. And so when I turned in the manuscript, my mother joked, she's like, all right, time for med school. Not that they're pushing me, but I was like, you know what? Not no. But I think that's probably why something in science writing is pulling me so hard, that, it's not that I'm about to go to med school tomorrow, but that, that initial interest has never really left me. And I hope to find ways to kind of find a way to incorporate it in my life. So kind of doctor, kind of writer, Jane did kind of take me in a different trajectory for a time.
Sounds good. All right, we have time for one final question this evening. I want to also plug before I ask it, just remember there's a link in the bio for The Learned Owl, so please purchase your copy of We Keep the Dead Close. We have signed copies available at The Learned Owl. All right, so Becky, I have one last question. Has anyone approached you for movie rights to this story?
What a nice question. Yes, I am having conversations about it. I Yes. It is in process. Nothing is firm. I think it is, with everything with this story, it's about how to do it sensitively. And, I've tried really hard to not have it be sensationalistic or lurid or to be entertainment devoid of a sense of the suffering of Jane and her friends and her family, and also of the people who have been, around whom suspicion has trailed for half their life, if not more. And so I think figuring out how to tell this story again, possibly, and preserve that sensitivity is a challenge that I welcome, but also that I take seriously.
Sounds good. And then I just want to say, Sue, I know you wrote, is there a conclusion regarding the killer? There is a conclusion, but we are not talking about it because honestly, it's worth the read and the suspense for it. So we're just not going to mention that. So I encourage you all to read the book. Becky, thank you so much for joining us here this evening. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Make sure to check out the library's website for our most up-to-date programs. And thank you all for being here this evening. Bye.